I've worked the same district of national forest for 19 years. People disappear out here more often than visitors think. Most of them turn up cold, scared, dehydrated, embarrassed to have cost a county $40,000 in helicopter time over a wrong turn, but alive. A few we find later, and those are the cases that age you. But the ones that still wake me at 3 in the morning, the ones I'm finally going to talk about, are the people who were never found and were never lost either. The ones who never made it into a single report. I want to tell this the way it happened, in order, because the order is the only thing that ever made it make sense to me. I'm not going to use the real name of the forest, and I'm not going to use my real name. If you know how the system works, you'll understand why by the end. If you don't, then maybe it's better for you to stay a visitor. When I started, this was a quiet posting. 4 permanent rangers, a rotating crew of seasonals in the summer, 1 law enforcement officer who covered 3 districts and was never around when you needed him, and a station that smelled like mildew and scorched coffee no matter what we did to it. The coffee maker was older than half the staff, and it made everything taste faintly of pennies. I mention that because the small things are what I learned to trust later, when I couldn't trust the big things anymore. People imagine the job as ridgelines and grisly rescues. Mostly it's paperwork, trail condition logs, maintenance requests, visitor incident reports, radio logs, where every transmission gets a timestamp and a unit number, scratched into a bound book that never leaves the dispatch desk. We ran everything through a federal case management system, the kind that's slow and ugly and never lets you delete anything, which is the whole point of it. Every incident gets a number. Every number gets a date, a reporting officer, a status open, closed, suspended, referred. Nothing is supposed to leave the system once it's in. That's not policy. That's law. A record exists so that years later, when memory fails and people lie and grief makes liars even of honest folks, the truth is still sitting in a drawer with a number on it. I believed that for 16 years. The first case that broke something open in me wasn't dramatic. That part matters. There was no scream in the dark, no blood on a trail marker. It was an ordinary Tuesday in September, the kind where the fog burns off by 10 and the parking lot fills with day hikers in brand new boots. A woman named Carol Hesley came into the station to ask about her brother. She was maybe 60, sensible shoes, reading glasses on a chain, and she had a folder under her arm because she was the kind of person who keeps folders, who writes the date on receipts, who would never in her life lose a man inside a bureaucracy. Her brother Daniel had driven up 3 weeks earlier to hike a loop near the North Basin. He'd texted her a photo from the trailhead. She showed it to me. Hands steady, voice not a heavy-set man grinning under a faded green ball cap. One shoulder strap of his pack twisted the way you don't notice until it's the only picture you have left. After that photo, nothing. She'd called the sheriff, called us, called the highway patrol, and now she was driving up in person because nobody could tell her anything that matched anything else. She talked about him while I worked, the way families do, because talking is the only thing that keeps the fear from filling the whole room. Daniel was the younger one, she said, the soft one. He'd taught middle school shop for 30 years and retired the spring before, and he hadn't known what to do with himself since. He'd never married. He'd looked after their mother until she passed, and after that it was just the 2 of them, and Carol had worried he was lonely, so she'd been glad when he took up hiking, because it got him out of the house and gave him something to send her photos of. She kept every one of those photos in a little album. He always wore that ball cap. He'd bought it on a trip the 2 of them took as kids and worn it 40 years, and the green had faded almost to gray, and she used to tease him that it looked like something a scarecrow would throw away. She said that last part, and then she stopped talking for a moment, because she'd made it a joke 100 times, and now the joke had a different weight, and she didn't know how to set it down. I sat there and listened, and I thought, this is a man somebody knows by heart. That's the part I keep coming back to. Whatever else happened to Daniel Hesley, he was not a stranger. He was the soft younger brother who looked after his mother and wore the same hat for 40 years and didn't know what to do with his retirement. He was a whole human life, fully witnessed by at least one person, and that should have been enough to anchor him to the record of the world. It wasn't. That's the thing I didn't understand yet, sitting across from his sister with her album and her folder. Being loved by one person turns out not to be enough. The machine I was about to find had done the math on exactly that. I pulled up the system to find Daniel's case. I wanted to give her the file number, the search timeline, the assigned officer, the works. We don't hide things from families. The opposite, we drown them in documentation. because paperwork is the only comfort the law lets us give. A grieving sister can't have her brother back, but she can have a binder, and sometimes the binder is the difference between a person who heals and a person who doesn't. There was no case. I searched his name, Daniel Hesley. Nothing. I searched the date range, every incident logged that month. 2 of them, a sprained ankle on the South Fork and a lost golden retriever, and neither was him. I searched the trailhead, the basin loop, every keyword I could think of. I actually laughed a little, the way you do when a computer's being stupid. I told her the system was ancient. The report was probably logged under a typo, or the sheriff's office had it because jurisdiction over missing adults gets murky out here and files slip between agencies like water between rocks. I told her I'd find it. She looked at me with a patience that was somehow worse than panic and said, "The other ranger already found it, 3 weeks ago. He read it to me over the phone. It had a number." That stopped me cold, because a member of the public doesn't know what a case number looks like unless somebody read them one. And she'd written it down, in her own careful hand, on the inside cover of her folder, a clean 9-digit string, year prefix, district code, sequence formatted exactly right. It was real. I typed it in. The system returned. No record found. I want to be precise about this because the precision is what got under my skin and never left. Our case numbers run sequential within a district and year. If you delete a record, the number doesn't vanish. It sits there as a gap, like a missing tooth, and anyone running an audit can see it. But when I typed Daniel Hesley's number, the system didn't show me a gap. It showed me a different case entirely. A culvert repair on a fire road. Logged, closed, signed off by a name I didn't recognize. The number had been reused. You cannot reuse a case number. The system is built specifically so you can't. I'd had that drilled into me in training like scripture, every number permanent and singular, forever. And yet here was Daniel Hesley's number, alive and well, attached to a drainage ditch. I told Carol I needed a day. I told her not to worry, which was a lie, and I think she knew it was a lie, because she'd been somebody's big sister for 60 years and she could read a man's face. She left me a copy of her folder, the photo, her notes, the timeline she'd built herself, more thorough than half the reports I'd filed in my career, and she drove 4 hours back home. At the door, she turned and said, "He's not the kind of man who just walks off. He calls me every Sunday. He's never once missed a Sunday." And I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count because it was true, and because the system that swallowed her brother was specifically designed so that a man who never missed a Sunday could vanish and have his sister be the only person in the world who knew the Sundays had stopped. That night I stayed late and went into the paper archive. We still kept hard copies then, everything filed and boxed by year in the back room under a fluorescent tube that buzzed and flickered on the left side like it was trying to finish a sentence it kept losing. I pulled the box for that quarter and went through every incident report by hand. Sprained ankle, lost dog, culvert, no Daniel. But the reports in that box ran sequential and there was a jump. Case 0419, then 0421, no 0420, a gap, a missing tooth, exactly like the computer should have shown me and hadn't. So I went back to the terminal and searched 0420 directly. The computer told me 0420 was the culvert, so the paper said the number was missing. The computer said the number was a ditch. And a grieving woman in another county had a slip of paper in her own handwriting that said the number belonged to her brother. 3 sources, 3 different answers. One of them had a man's whole life inside it. I told myself it was a glitch, a migration error, a corrupted index, something boring and technical. I'm a practical man. I've spent a career not believing in ghosts, because the woods don't need ghosts. They've got hypothermia and cliff edges and 100 ways for your own confidence to kill you. So I went hunting for the boring explanation, and I want you to understand that I genuinely tried to find it, because the absence of a boring explanation is the whole horror of this thing. The ranger Carol had spoken to was a man named Gerald Pruitt. He'd transferred out the month before, supposedly to a posting 2 states over. I'd worked beside Pruitt for 2 years, quiet, careful, the best man I knew for finding a faint trail in fog, the kind of partner who didn't talk much but never once let you down. I had his cell from an old call sheet. I texted him, kept it casual, just asked if he remembered logging a missing hiker named Hesley, because the family was asking and I couldn't find the file. He didn't answer that night, or the next day. About a week later, one message came back. It said, "Don't pull that thread. Let it close itself. I'm telling you as a friend. I called him immediately. The number was disconnected. Now, I could have stopped there, and there's a version of me that did, that filed Carol Hesley under tragic confusion and went back to writing trail logs. But I'm built wrong for that, and I had her folder on my desk, and Pruitt's text felt less like a warning than a confession. So I started doing the thing I knew how to do, not detective work, ranger work, patterns, and patience. The first place I went was the radio logs. Every search and rescue operation generates a river of radio traffic, all of it time-stamped and logged at the dispatch desk in a bound book and, on the bigger ops, recorded to a digital archive on a 30-day rolling cycle that gets backed up before it overwrites. 3 weeks was inside the window. If there'd been any kind of search for Daniel Hesley, even a single ranger called out to check a trailhead, there'd be a transmission, a unit number, a timestamp, a location. I pulled the bound dispatch book for those dates and read every line by hand. It was tedious. Half of it is units calling in lunch breaks and asking about gate codes, and the traffic flowed normally, hour by hour, except for one stretch on a Thursday afternoon where there was simply nothing for 2 hours and 40 minutes, no transmissions at all. Not a single unit checking in across an entire district on a busy September weekday. That doesn't happen. Somebody's always on the radio. A clean 2-hour, 40-minute silence in a dispatch log is as unnatural as a clean 2-hour silence in your own heartbeat. I went to the digital archive to pull the audio for that window. The file was there. The timestamps were there. But when I played it, those 2 hours and 40 minutes were a flat, even hiss, not dead air, not silence. But the smooth recorded nothing of a channel that's been wiped and left running, so the timestamps stay continuous. You can hear the difference if you've listened to as many of these as I have. Real silence on a forest channel still has texture wind on the mic, a distant unit keying up by accident, the little electronic breath of the repeater. This had none of it. It was the audio equivalent of a freshly mopped floor. Somebody had reached into the radio archive, lifted out 2 hours and 40 minutes, and laid down clean hiss in its place, careful to keep the timestamps unbroken so the gap wouldn't show. That's not a glitch. A glitch is sloppy. This was the opposite of sloppy. This was housekeeping. I started keeping my own records after that, at home, off the network, a cheap notebook with a cardboard cover, the kind you buy for a kid's first day of school. I wrote down everything from memory while it was fresh, the way you'd write a deposition, plain facts, dates, no speculation, because I had started to understand that the official memory of these events could not be trusted, and a man's own handwriting in a drawer was the only kind of record nobody else could reach. Or, so I thought. The second place I went was the trailhead registers. These are the little metal boxes at the major trailheads where hikers sign in voluntarily name, date, destination, estimated time out. Nobody curates them. They're just damp pads of paper that a seasonal collects every few weeks and stuffs into a drawer that nobody ever opens again. They're not part of any system, and that's exactly why I trusted them. Whatever was cleaning the official record had no reason to think about a drawer full of soggy sign-in sheets. I found Daniel in the Basin Loop register. Hesley, D. North Basin Loop Est. 5 hours. Real ink, real paper, his own pressure on the page, the tail of the Y on Hesley dragged out like a man in a hurry to get walking. I sat there in the back room under the buzzing light with my thumb on his signature for a long time. Carol had told me he signed everything, checks, cards, the guest book at her kitchen table at Thanksgiving. Here was the last time he ever signed his name, in a metal box nobody was supposed to care about, and it was the only place left in the world that admitted he'd been here at all. I thought about photographing it, and then I thought about the radio file and the map, and I understood that anything I documented through any device that touched the network might simply stop existing. So I did the only safe thing. I tore the page out of the register and folded it into my wallet, behind my license where it still is. It is the single most important document I own, and it is a stolen sheet of damp paper. I started cross-referencing the registers against the case system, line by line, going back years. It took me months of late nights. I'd carry a register home, sit at my kitchen table with my off-network notebook and my work laptop, and check every signature against the database. Most matched something or matched nothing in a way that made ordinary sense, the normal churn of people who hike and leave and go on living. But a small number signed in, never signed out, and had no incident report of any kind. No search, no closure, no mention anywhere. as though they'd walked into the trees and the only thing that ever knew it was a damp page in a metal box. Over 15 years, there were 11 of them. And the 11 had something in common, and once I saw it, I couldn't make it back into a coincidence. They were alone. Not just hiking alone, alone in the world. A widower whose grown kids didn't speak to him. A young woman traveling solo from overseas. Family on another continent who maybe didn't know what country she was in that month. A man who paid for his campsite in cash and gave a name that didn't trace to anything. Daniel Hesley, whose only family was a sister 4 hours away with a folder. They were the people who could disappear twice and have it stick first from the forest, then from the record, because a record only gets defended when somebody on the outside is pulling on it. And these were people no one was pulling for. I sat with that one a long while. I want to be honest about the shape of it. It wasn't that these people were unloved. Daniel was loved. Carol loved him enough to drive 4 hours and build a timeline tighter than mine. It was that they were loved by too few people, by the kind of people whose grief is quiet and law-abiding and runs out of money and dies of a stroke before it can become an investigation. The system hadn't chosen the unloved. It had chosen the underdefended. There's a difference, and the difference is the cruelest part, because it means the machine understood exactly what it was doing. It was counting on the smallness of certain people's circles. It was betting that one sister, alone, could not make enough noise to matter. And it had been right about Carol. It had already won that bet before I ever opened her folder. I learned later, months later, that Carol Hesley died of a stroke the following spring, still calling the sheriff's office every few weeks, still keeping her folder, still waiting for a Sunday that was never going to come. And when she died, the last living person who remembered that Daniel had ever existed died with her, except for me, a stranger who met her once. That's the quiet engineering of the thing. It doesn't even need to kill the people who ask questions. It only needs to wait. Grief is mortal. The record was supposed to be the thing that outlived grief. That's the whole reason records were invented. And somebody had figured out that if you remove the record, then all you have to do is wait for the mourners to die, and the person is gone twice and forever, and no law was ever broken that anyone can point to. It would be almost a year before the second case, the one I logged myself. And I'll get there, but I have to tell you about the maps first. Because the maps are where the scale of it opened up under me like a sinkhole. I'd been plotting the 11 where each one signed in, where, if anywhere, any gear was found. They clustered, not perfectly but unmistakably, around a band of high country in the northeast quarter, the North Basin, the North Ridge, Daniel's country. So I went to the wall map to study that ground, and I noticed something I had somehow not noticed in 19 years, which only tells you how the mind shields you from a thing until it can't anymore. There's an area up there, maybe 4 square miles, that isn't really on the map. I don't mean blank. Blank would be honest. Blank is what you do for a sensitive site. You draw a box, you write restricted, and everyone understands. This was worse. The terrain was drawn, the contour lines marched right across it, the creeks were there, the elevations were labeled. But every trail, every fire road, every marked route bent away from those 4 square miles. They curved around it like a stream going around a stone. No trail entered it. No trail crossed it. There was no label, no boundary, no reason given. Just a hole in the human part of the map, with all the paths politely steering you elsewhere, drawn so smoothly that for 19 years my eye had slid right over it. I pulled an old map, a 1970s survey we kept rolled in a cardboard tube in the corner, because rangers don't throw maps away even when they're retired. I unrolled it across the back table and weighted the corners with a stapler and a coffee mug, and there it was. On the old map, that ground had trails, a whole network of them, a named loop. A spur running to a marked structure, field station Goft. With a smaller note beside it I had to bend close to read under the bad light. Decommissioned. Access restricted. The old map showed a place. The new map showed an absence shaped exactly like that place. Somewhere between the 70s and now, those 4 square miles had been quietly unmapped. Not closed closing leaves a record, a closure order with a date and a reason and a signing official. This had been erased the same way the people were erased, by routing everything around it until the thing stopped officially existing, while remaining, of course, entirely and physically there. Before I requested anything, I went looking for the closure order itself, because every action in a federal forest generates a document, and a field station doesn't just decommission on its own. There's a closure order, a numbered administrative action, signed and dated, kept in the historical files. I spent a whole weekend in the deepest part of the archive, the part nobody touches, the shelves where the dust lies so thick and undisturbed it holds the shape of your fingers after you pull a box. I found closure orders for everything else. A campground shut in 1981, a lookout tower retired in 1994, a fire road washed out and abandoned in 2003, each one a clean, numbered document with a reason and a signature. For the field station, there was nothing, but in the master index, the ledger that lists every administrative action by number, there was an entry, a number, a date in 1976, and where the description should have been, a single typed line, see superseding file. There was no superseding file. I checked the number it should have led to. That number's description read, see superseding file, and that one led to another. I followed it through 4 entries, each one pointing to the next, a chain of references folding back on itself, until the 5th entry pointed back to the first. And I understood I was holding a loop with nothing inside it, a circle of paperwork built to look like a trail of documents that, if you actually walked it, simply walked you in a ring and let you out exactly where you started, having learned nothing, having touched nothing, the bureaucratic equivalent of the trails on the map that curve politely around the hole. Somebody had not destroyed the record of the field station. That would have left a gap. Instead, they had built a record that was all surface and no center, a document you could read forever and never reach the bottom of, and I sat on the floor of that archive with 5 photocopies fanned out in front of me and felt, for the first time, genuinely afraid not of the woods, but of the filing system, which I had spent my whole life believing was the one honest thing in the building. I made a correction request through proper channels anyway. I wrote it up clean discrepancy between current trail inventory and the 1,974 survey, missing closure documentation for a structure in the northeast quarter, request for historical file. I filed it like a man who simply loves good records, because by then I'd learned that the safest disguise inside a bureaucracy is the disguise of caring too much about accuracy. 2 days later, the 1970s map was gone from the tube. I want to be careful here, because this is where the story stops being about dead files and starts being about me. I'd unrolled that map on the back table. I'd rolled it up myself and slid it into the tube and stood it back in the corner. Nobody else came into that archive. I had the only after-hours key besides the supervisor, and 2 days after I filed a request that referenced it, the tube held a different map, a current one. No 1970s survey anywhere in the room. I tore that archive apart over a weekend, every box, every shelf, every drawer thick with dust that hadn't moved in years, and the old survey was simply not in the building anymore. The correction request I'd filed came back marked, no supporting documentation located closed. That was the first time I understood, in my body and not just my head, that something was watching the records I touched. Not watching me, exactly watching the files. I'd reached for a thread and the thread had been pulled out of my hand and out of the room, and the only fingerprint left was the new emptiness in the tube. The machine wasn't hunting me. It was tidying behind me, the way you'd follow a child through a house, quietly putting things back as he pulls them off the shelves. And a thing that tidies behind you without ever showing its face is, I learned, far worse to live with than a thing that chases you. You can run from a thing that chases you. You cannot run from a thing that simply restores the absence wherever you've made a presence. There was a second moment, smaller, that I've never told anyone, and it frightened me more than the map. A week after the map vanished, I came in early, before anyone, and the terminal at my desk was already logged in to my account. With the case search screen open, and in the search field, already typed but not yet entered, was Daniel Hesley's name. I had not done that. I lock my terminal every time I stand up. 19 years of habit. You don't leave a federal system open. I stood there looking at his name sitting in that field in the gray light with the cursor blinking after it, waiting for someone to press enter, and I understood it was not a search. It was a message. It was the system showing me that it knew exactly which thread I was pulling, and that it could sit at my desk, in my account, and type his name with my own credentials anytime it wanted to. I deleted the name letter by letter and locked the screen and sat in my truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could go back inside. The second case put it past doubt. A college kid, 19, named Marcus Theroux, went out on a day hike in late October and didn't come back. His roommate reported it. This one was clean from the start, by the book, because I took the report myself and I ran the operation myself. I assigned the number. I built the SAR timeline. We did a real search. And I want to walk you through it properly, because the difference between this and Daniel is that I was there for every minute of it, and that's what makes its disappearance unbearable. Day 1, we treated it as a routine overdue hiker, the most common call we get. His car was in the North Ridge lot, locked, a parking receipt on the dash. We established the point last seen at his vehicle and started hasty searches up the most likely trail, two-person teams calling his name, checking the obvious hazards first, the places people fall. We pulled his trip plan off the register he'd signed in, North Ridge Spur, back by dark. His roommate gave us a description: blue rain shell, gray pack, new boots, and a habit of taking the harder fork whenever a trail split because he was trying to get in shape. That detail shaped our whole search. We weighted the steeper routes. Day 2, when the hasty search came up empty, it became a full operation. I requested a helicopter, and it came, and I logged the flight myself, tail number, pilot, hours, the cost code we'd bill it against. We brought in 2 K9 teams. We set up a real command post in the lower lot, a folding table and a coffee urn, and a wall of grid maps where I marked off sectors in grease pencil as they were cleared. We had volunteers, the local search and rescue group, 11 of them, and they signed in on a clipboard, name and time in, name and time out. The way you do so, you don't accidentally leave a searcher in the field overnight. We worked expanding rings outward from his car. The dogs got interested near the spur but lost it at a creek, which happens. Water kills scent. That night I briefed the team by lantern and we planned day 3. Day 3, a seasonal named Devon, a girl, 22, her first season. The kind of new that still believes every search ends with someone found, was working the high sector off the North Ridge Spur when she found his water bottle wedged in some rocks a good distance off any trail. She radioed it in, and her voice was shaking. When I got up to her, she was sitting in the trail with the bottle in her 2 hands, and she was crying because the bottle was still 3/4 full. She kept saying it. It's still full. He wasn't even thirsty. Whatever happened, it happened fast. He didn't even drink. I told her she was reading too much into a water bottle. I bagged it as evidence, tagged it, logged it. I told her people drop full bottles all the time. I didn't believe a word of it. A 19-year-old trying to get in shape, taking the hard forks, does not leave a full bottle wedged in rocks off the trail and walk into nothing. We searched a 4th day on our own time, unofficially, the way you do when it gets personal. We never found Marcus. That happens. There's a percentage the forest simply keeps, and a good ranger makes his peace with the percentage, or the percentage breaks him. I closed the case as unresolved suspended, which keeps the file open enough to add tips, closed enough to stop burning resources. The number went into the system. The paper file, my notes, the grid maps, the evidence tag, the helicopter log, the clipboard sheets went into the box. I signed the closure line, my own hand. 6 weeks later, a tip came in, a possible sighting at a bus depot 2 states away. Almost certainly nothing, but you log it. You always log it. I went to update the file. The case was gone. Not suspended, not closed, gone. The number returned a trail maintenance report. The paper file was missing from the box, and the box had been reorganized so the sequence ran smooth with no gap. The clipboard sign-in sheets were not in the operations folder where I'd put them. And the helicopter log, this is the part that finished me, because the helicopter is a contractor, an outside company with its own billing and its own FAA reportable flight records, completely outside our system. The contractor's log showed no flight in this district on those dates. 20 people, 3 days, a helicopter, and no record anywhere that any of it had occurred. A glitch can eat a database entry. A glitch cannot make 20 volunteers' clipboards walk out of a folder. It cannot make a contractor's helicopter unfly and unbill itself. It cannot reorganize a box of paper so the missing tooth grows back. That is an error. That's labor. Somebody, by keystroke and by hand, had reached into every system that touched Marcus through ours, and the ones that weren't ours, and lifted him out, and then closed the cloth over the hole, thread by thread, until you'd never know a thread had been pulled. I went to find Devon, the seasonal who'd cried over the water bottle. I wanted one other human being who remembered the search the way I did. Her season had ended. I had her number from the volunteer roster. When I called, she remembered me. She remembered her summer. She remembered most of the people. She did not remember Marcus Theroux. She did not remember the water bottle. She did not remember crying in a trail. When I pushed gently, I was careful she got quiet and then a little frightened, the way you get when someone insists you said something you're sure you never said, and she said, "Are you okay? You sound like you haven't slept." And the worst part is that she was being kind. The system hadn't gotten to her memory. There was nothing in her memory to get to. The search had been lifted out of her too, or it had never been allowed to set in her in the first place, and I will never know which, and not knowing which is its own slow horror. So I had two ghosts now, Daniel and Marcus, and I had 11 names from the registers, and I had a wiped radio archive and a vanished map and a healed box of paper and a girl who'd forgotten a man she'd wept over. I had everything except the one thing a record is supposed to give you, which is a place to stand. I decided to go to the only place left that the machine hadn't reached. I decided to walk into the 4 square miles that weren't on the map. I picked a clear day on my own time, told no one, signed in at no register, brought my own gear, and carried a map I'd drawn myself by hand from memory of the 1970s survey before it disappeared. It is the only time in 19 years I went into the backcountry off the books, and I did it precisely because being on the books was no longer a way of being remembered. It had become the mechanism by which people were selected to be forgotten. The ground up there is old. Big timber, little undergrowth, that high cathedral light that comes down in long shafts between the trunks, and you can see 100 yards between the trees, and somehow the openness is worse than thick brush, because brush at least hides you, and open ground means that whatever is in the country can see you coming as easily as you can see it. I found one of the old trails, or its bones, a faint depression in the duff, an occasional cut stump gone soft and green, the skeleton of a path the Forest Service had stopped maintaining decades ago, and then stopped admitting had ever existed. About a mile in, I found a trail marker that should not have been there. On unmapped ground, on a trail that officially didn't exist, there was a standard carcinite post, the flexible fiberglass kind we install by the thousands, and on it, riveted, a metal trail tag stamped with a route code. The code was in our current format, not the 70s format. Current. Which meant somebody in the modern era, somebody with access to our sign shop and our numbering convention, had walked into the country that doesn't exist and marked a trail that isn't on any map with a code from a system that pretends the whole place is gone. I stood there and ran my thumb over the stamped digits the way I'd run it over Daniel's signature, and I understood that the erasing wasn't historical. It wasn't a thing that had happened once in the 70s and left a mess. It was current. It was maintained. Somebody was still walking these trails, still keeping them marked, still using them, in a place they had erased from the world precisely so that they could. The marker pointed to the field station, and I followed it. It was a cluster of low concrete buildings, the stripped institutional kind they built in the 60s for things they didn't want to explain. Flat roofs half fallen in, a chain-link fence rusted to lace, a few signs faded almost to nothing. I could still make out the Federal Eagle and, under it, the words, "No trespassing, monitoring in progress," and a phone number with an area code that hadn't been used in this region since before I was born. Monitoring in progress. On a building with a pine tree growing up through its collapsed roof. I went inside. I shouldn't have. The floor was the slow wreckage of a place no one tends leaves. Animal sign, a filing cabinet tipped on its side with the drawers sprung open and emptied, but not entirely emptied. Wedged behind the back of the bottom drawer, where it had slid down and been overlooked when someone cleared the rest, was a single folder. Manila, water-stained, the metal clasp gone green with corrosion. Inside were forms. Old one's typewriter typeface, the violet ink of carbon copies, intake forms. Each one had a name, a date, a line for circumstances of arrival, a line for next of kin, known contacts, and at the bottom a line I read 4 times before I understood it, disposition of public record. And beside that line, on each form, somebody had typed one of 2 things. Either a case number the same 9-digit format as ours, year prefix and all, or the single word none. I understood then. The erasing was not a malfunction, and it was not the cover-up of some single terrible crime. It was a procedure. It had a form. The act of removing a human being from the records of the world had once been, in this concrete building, an administrative function with an intake sheet and a disposition line as routine as a culvert repair, as ordinary as the ditch they'd named after Daniel Hesley. There were 19 forms in that one folder, clearly one survivor of hundreds that had filled that cabinet before someone cleared it out and missed the one that fell behind. The dates ran back to the 70s. The circumstances line had its own clipped dialect, unaffiliated subject, no reporting party anticipated, and one I had to sit on the cold floor and stare at for a long while. Low salience individual. A bureaucrat's words for a person no one would notice was gone. 3 of the 19 names I already had, from my 11. The overlap was the proof I'd been afraid of finding. My 15 years of soggy trailhead registers and that cabinet's decades of intake forms were describing the same machine from opposite ends. One end where people walked in off a parking lot, the other end where they were processed out of existence. I took the folder. Of course I took it. I walked out of that valley faster than I'd walked in, and I did not look back at the buildings, not out of fear of something behind me, but out of a colder fear, the understanding that the buildings didn't need anyone inside them to do their work. The work was the system. The system didn't require a monster. It only required that the rest of us keep filing. I made the mistake, then, of going to Marlene Voss. She was the district administrator, 15 years senior to me, and the most controlled person I have ever known, not cold exactly, just smooth, like water frozen so hard it stopped reflecting anything. I didn't show her the folder. I'm not a complete fool. I told her I'd been doing a records audit, which was true, and that I'd found discrepancies in the northeast quarter gaps in the trail inventory, a missing closure order for a structure, a survey map that had walked out of the archive. I framed it as a man who loved clean records and wanted them clean. I made myself sound like a clerk. She let me finish. Then she did something I didn't expect. She didn't argue, didn't deny, didn't explain. She opened a drawer in her own desk, took out a single sheet of paper, and slid it across to me face down. Then she stood and said she was getting coffee and asked if I wanted any, and she left the room, which she never did, and she was gone long enough. I turned it over. It was an intake form. The modern version, our current letterhead, our current case number format. The circumstances of arrival line read, low salience individual. The next of kin, known contacts, line read, none located, and in the name field, typed, clean, was my own name. The disposition of public record line was blank. She came back with 2 coffees, set one in front of me, and didn't look at the paper at all, as if it weren't there, as if she'd never touched it. She sat down and folded her hands and said only this, the forest takes people. That part isn't anyone's doing, that's just what wilderness is. The rest of it isn't a secret you uncover. It's a duty somebody hands you. The man before me handed it to me. I file what I'm trained to file. She paused, and for the first time in all the years I'd known her, something moved behind her face, not fear. I'd have understood fear. It was closer to grief worn so smooth by carrying it that she only felt it now because I'd brushed against the weight. You'll be good at it, she said. You already think in records. That's the only qualification there's ever been. I asked her who built it, who ran it now. She picked up the form, my form, and slid it back into her drawer, and the small, ordinary click of that drawer closing told me more than any speech could have. She said, no one runs it. That's the part people can't hold in their heads. It ran as a program, and then the program ended, and the thing it taught the system to do just kept being done, because by then it was procedure, and procedure doesn't need a person. It needs a form and somebody trained not to ask what the form is for. She stood, signaling the meeting was over, and at the door she added, almost gently, drink your coffee. It's terrible, I know. It always has been. I should have stopped. I had a confession of a kind, a folder, 11 names, 19 forms, a wiped radio archive, a vanished map. A reasonable man takes that to a journalist or a federal inspector and walks away. I tried. I wanted on the record, even this record, that I tried. I made copies of everything I had. I drove to a city. I sat across a table from a reporter who took it seriously, who photographed the folder, who said he'd pull the decommissioning order and the field station history, the threads I couldn't reach from inside. He called me twice. The third time, the number rang to a generic voicemail that wasn't his. When I drove back to the city, the outlet told me no one by that name had ever worked there. I'm not going to dress that up or explain it. I'm just going to tell you it happened and let you sit with it the way I've had to sit with it. When I got home, my off-network notebook was gone from the drawer where I kept it. Nothing else in the house was touched. Just the notebook, the cheap one with the cardboard cover, the one that existed nowhere but my kitchen, that I'd never told a soul about, that had no number, no copy, no place in any system. They took the one record that was purely mine and left everything else, and I understood the message perfectly. It wasn't a threat. It was a correction. I had created an unauthorized record of people who were supposed to have none, and the system had simply done to my notebook what it does to everything. It restored the absence. The page from the trailhead register, The one folded in my wallet behind my license they never found. It is still there. It is the only thing I have ever managed to keep. That was 3 years ago. I still work here. I know how that sounds. I thought about leaving, and then I understood that leaving was just another kind of disappearing. A ranger who quits and moves away and stops talking is, from the world's point of view, exactly as gone as a man who walks into the North Basin and gets routed around on the map. Staying is the only thing I've found that keeps me real. I file my reports. I keep my numbers clean. By every external measure, I am a model of the institution, and I've become one on purpose, so that no one ever again looks at me the way Marlene looked at me across that desk with that terrible, tired tenderness, already grieving a man who was still sitting in his chair, still warm, still drinking the terrible coffee. Marlene retired last spring. There was a small cake in the break room and a card we all signed. She shook my hand and held it a half second too long and said, "You'll be fine. You file what you're trained to file." Then she was gone, to a coast somewhere, and I have not been able to find any record of where she went, though I've stopped looking because I'm afraid of what I'll find, which is nothing at all. I'm the senior records officer now. They gave me the back room with the buzzing light. They gave me the keys to the paper archive and the administrator login to the case system. And they gave me, without ever once saying the words, the form. Because last month a young woman came into the station, mid-20s, the hollow, scraped-out look of someone who hasn't slept since the phone stopped getting answered. Her father had driven up to hike alone after a divorce the way men do, trying to walk something out of themselves. He'd texted her a photo from a trailhead. A heavy-set man grinning under a faded green ball cap, one shoulder strap of his pack twisted the way you don't notice until it's the only picture you have left. After that, nothing. She sat in the chair Carol Hesley had sat in, and she did what Carol did. What they all do, she talked, because the talking holds back the fear. She told me her dad had taken up hiking after the divorce because the house was too quiet and a counselor had told him to find something that got him moving. She told me he wasn't good at it, that he got winded on hills, that he packed too much and wore cotton and did everything wrong and loved it anyway. She told me he called her every night from the road, even from places with no signal. He'd drive to the top of a rise just to get one bar and say goodnight. She showed me the photo on her phone, and her thumb hovered over his face the way Carol's hand had hovered over her album, and she said the ball cap was older than she was, and that her mother used to threaten to throw it out and her dad would hide it, and now her mother was gone from his life, and the hat was still here, in the last photo, faded almost to gray, and she laughed a little, and the laugh broke in the middle. I pulled up the system and started taking the report. My hand assigned the number before my mind had agreed to anything. 19 years of training lives in the hand, not the head. And at the bottom of the intake screen, in a field I had clicked past 10,000 times without ever once reading, in a drop-down menu I'd never had a reason to question, there it was. The line I'd read 4 times on a cold concrete floor in a valley that does not appear on any map, disposition of public record. And the drop-down had 2 options. I looked at her, at the scraped-out grief and the phone still warm in her hand and the photo of a soft man in a bad hat who drove to the tops of hills to say goodnight. I asked, the way the form asks, gently, professionally, whether there was anyone else, a mother still in the picture, brothers or sisters, a big family, anyone who would be calling, anyone who would never stop. I told myself I was being thorough. I told myself I was being kind. I was doing neither. I was reading the disposition criteria out loud and calling it compassion. She said it was just her. She said her grandmother had passed in the spring and her parents' divorce had scattered everyone, and there was no one else now. No aunts she was close to, no cousins she could name, just her and her dad, and now just her. She tried to smile when she said it. She said, "It's only me looking for him, but I'll look as long as it takes. I'm not going to stop." And I believed her. That's the part I can't put down. I believed she would not stop, the way Carol did not stop, and I knew exactly what not stopping had bought Carol: a folder, a stroke, and a brother gone twice. I had it in my power, right there, to give this young woman the one thing the machine is built to deny: a record, a number she could call, a binder she could hold in the dark, proof in a federal drawer that her father had been here and had been looked for and had mattered enough to write down, and my hand moved to the drop-down. I'd like to tell you which option I chose. I'd like to tell you I'm the one who finally refused, who left the case open, who set the whole machine on fire, who let the world grieve a man in a green ball cap and a daughter who deserved a binder full of paper she could hold in the dark, A daughter who said she would not stop and meant it. But you came looking for this. You typed a name, or a name like his, into something, and a system somewhere returned this account to you instead of an answer. And that should tell you everything about which option the form selected, and everything about which option gets selected, in the end, for the ones who go looking too hard for the people the woods were quietly allowed to keep. I filed what I was trained to file. You should stop pulling this thread now. I'm telling you as a friend.